So we need to talk about guardianship laws. With this getting more attention recently because of a documentary about the talk show host Wendy Williams, with many saying they're just the perfect environment for abuse. And of course, this likely isn't the first time you've thought about something like this. I mean, Britney Spears was in a well-known decade-long legal battle to get out from under the thumb of her guardian. But with everything that we've seen in recent years, things might actually be changing as lawmakers and activists across the country have been making serious efforts to overhaul the laws and put more safeguards in place. But to properly talk about this, we got to back up a little bit and ask the question of, well, what is a guardianship exactly? And well, it really depends on where you live. Sometimes they have slightly different names, like here in California, they're called conservatorships. But the idea is that basically the courts decide an adult cannot make decisions for themselves due to a mental or a physical condition, they put someone else in charge. But the most recent numbers showing that there are 1.3 million American adults that have been deemed unable to make decisions for themselves. Although according to the Center for Public Integrity, we have woefully inadequate data in the United States on this issue. There is no national source of guardianship data. And adding many states are not keeping data on who's under guardianship, how many people are under guardianship, or why they're under guardianship. While exact numbers are hard to come by, judges that spoke to ProPublica claimed that most guardianships are because of dementia and Alzheimer's, such as in the case of Wendy Williams. And her situation is also a great example of why so many families are frustrated with the system and why many feel an overhaul is needed. Right back in late 2021, her bank petitioned the court to get her a guardian, claiming that her family was abusing her financially, which was granted in 2022. And at the time, she was living with her family in Miami, and the bank thought that her son, Kevin Hunter Jr., was using her money, which lines up with one of the most common ways older people are abused, for their financial assets. In fact, according to MetLife's study of elder financial abuse, an estimated $2.9 billion is lost every year because of this. Sadly, though, that is also not the only way. In some instances, physical or sexual abuse happens. And there's a real frustration that the only person generally holding guardians accountable is a judge. When there are other agencies helping out, they're often severely understaffed and unable to adequately audit wards. But regardless, Hunter Jr. denies any and all accusations and claims, "My mom made me power of attorney because at that time, the bank started accusing the family of doing things that weren't true and saying that my mom wasn't fit to make choices. The court tried to frame it as though I was making all these charges for my own happiness. But even though her family has the means to take care of her, the courts decided otherwise and made attorney Sabrina Morrissey her guardian. And in this case, attorneys like Bernard A. Crooks, who specializes in elder law and special needs development, he suggested to The Hollywood Reporter that Morrissey was put in charge to avoid family infighting, saying, "I've been doing this for almost 40 years, and I would say that what I'm seeing in my practice is more fighting among siblings and family members, which has led to courts giving guardianship more to independent entities or entities that they believe are independent, like banks or other financial institutions." Now, as frustrating as all this is for Williams and her family, she's actually relatively lucky. Because in New York, most people who are in need of a guardian, they don't have one, either because they don't have family or friends at all, or because they're unwilling to take on that role. And in those instances, private attorneys are the go-to, but they also often refuse to do the job unless the client has substantial assets, meaning that thousands of more common people in New York are just left out to dry, which is why we saw the nonprofit Guardianship Access New York asking legislators for just $5 million out of the nearly $250 billion budget to give these so-called unbefriended individuals better guardianship services. But that ended up getting denied and just $1 million was allocated, which is hardly enough to manage the assets and take care of these people. Also, another major issue facing the state is how little oversight there is because of underfunding. Right? Technically, the guardians of the roughly 17,000 people they are being watched over need to file reports detailing the finances and care of their wards. But in New York, they only have 157 people to audit those reports. And making matters worse is that these audits can take years to complete, which is more than enough time for some shady person to screw someone over. But there is some good news, though not for New York, because they're not really doing much to change the situation. But other states are trying to make the system better. Over in Illinois, for example, Democratic Representative Tara Costa Howard has drafted legislation to try and tone down how much private firms are able to abuse the system, with her actually being inspired to do this after taking on the role herself and finding out that a private guardianship company and a law firm were working with hospitals to funnel would-be wards to their services. With her going on to say what this little piece of legislation has uncovered is a huge problem. Elder care is a big, big mess. In our chamber, in our legislature, this is an issue people are willing to fight for. People weren't paying attention to this until I raised it. I brought it up, and now we're going to go. Now, with that, it is not a law yet, but it is a start. And hopefully, it can get to the level that states like Pennsylvania and California are at, which, those are also imperfect. Or Pennsylvania, for example, just passed a major bill that makes it much, much harder for private firms to heavily profit off of taking care of those who have no one else. And it makes sense because there's this weird power dynamic going on if you're someone who needs a guardian but has no one but a private firm to go to. Or even worse, if you're incapable of realizing you need a guardian. It's just an entire ecosystem that's ready to be abused. abused. And with this, California also updated its conservatorship laws back in late 2023 for the first time in 50 years with unanimous approval. And in that case, it actually expanded who could qualify as someone who needs a guardian to include those with substance abuse issues. Because in the past, the law tried hard to protect those with mental health issues or substance abuse issues from being forced into treatment, and this changes that. It'll also require updates on whether that person continues to need a guardian, which is something it also does for adults with developmental issues, which is something that advocates would be happy with, because one of the biggest complaints is that many states, California included, often impose plenary guardianships, or with that meaning they're usually in perpetuity, like with what happened to Britney Spears. And in those cases, there's relatively little oversight once it's established, making it extremely difficult for someone to get out of one. Although at the same time, cases like Britney's are fringe ones because, like we mentioned before, most guardianships are established because of things like dementia, which, that's not a situation that's going to get better for the victim. And after hearing all this, you might think, man, the whole thing, it sounds awful, but it's also really not the case. These are things that are super important and when done properly, generally help protect people. But because of how much power they give to a guardian, it's an open invitation for abuse, which is why, according to many advocates, the single biggest thing that can be done to help reform guardianships, data, more and more data. Right? I touched on this at the start, but we have almost no single data point for all of this information. Everything is different state to state, and many collect almost no data, which is why there's a real push to get a national database set up, and the U.S. Government Accountability Office has even pushed Congress on the issue. Though the most recent bill that was introduced in 2023 has stalled out. And in the meantime, without the data, it's going to be an uphill battle to make any meaningful changes in many states. And it's not like this is an issue that just goes away. It is expected that the need for guardians is only going to expand, especially as we're now all getting older, and with that come diseases and dementia. With all that said, I got to ask you your opinions in general, but especially I'd love to know your thoughts if you or someone you know has been in a situation like this.